Welcome to our world, the world of the Underdark, the Abyss, Time, and Space, the world of SaturD&D. Our adventure takes place in the world of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, using the Out of the Abyss adventure. I am the Dungeon Master, Beard. I believe in a healthy dose of customization to this sort of thing, so there will be many elements that are either slightly modified or even completely different from what the adventure details. I did my best in working the characters into the story and vice versa, rather than having the characters just placed into the adventure haphazardly. It makes for a much more enjoyable experience for both the players and the DM. I hope you enjoy our dumb little adventure. It is split into 3 seasons, and I will be providing a summary at key points in the episodes between seasons. There will be this one, an episode 0, if you will, explaining all the events that happened before we started recording and streaming our sessions, as a sort of introduction or primer to the characters, the story, and the players thus far. There will then be another summary at the end of Season 1, explaining everything between Episode 0 and that pivotal and exciting session at the end. And finally, there will be yet a third summary at the end of Season 2, detailing the events during that time. That way, if you wish to catch up in episodes, it will be much easier to do so without having to listen to the hours upon hours of game sessions. But, with all the out-of-character jargon taken care of, let us continue. Our adventure started as most do, humbly but abruptly. But to truly begin our tale, we must know those that are involved in its history, both past, present, and its future. The first of these is the roguish human doctor, Rubin Givsvatvi, played by Shaw. A man of few words, Rubin is an adept man of the medicinal arts, learned and skilled. He lived his life in his hometown, learning and practicing his trade, though one day that came to an abrupt end. A young girl, the daughter to the regent of the town, fell ill. Rubin was called upon, one of the more premier and noted doctors in the town. But, despite his best efforts, the young girl soon perished from the mysterious affliction that seemed to tear at her, body, mind, and soul. Her death was placed at his feet and hands, and he was labeled a sham and a charlatan by the regent. Knowing it was not his steady hand and educated mind that caused her death, but something more sinister, he was stricken with grief, fear, and guilt, and fled from the town and the persecution that followed. But his kind heart and passion to help those in need, supported by the oath he swore when he took up medicine, drove him to continue helping those in need wherever he went. But the shadows and demons of his past hounded him. Eventually, his nights became restless, waking up in cold sweats from nightmares he could not remember. Worse and worse they continued, until one night, while taking shelter in the mouth of a cave from a stormy night on the road, the dark, nameless nightmare finally made itself known. Dark shadows seemed to move in and reach out towards him as he wandered, lost, through endless mazes of tunnels, caves, and hallways. Oily black tentacles slid out from between the stone and tiles and brushed up against him, while a great buzzing and howling echoed closer and closer from the distance. Festering wounds on living and dead creatures, and even on the walls and floor and ceiling themselves, burst open in clouds of spores, crawling masses of maggots, and swarms of insects. A massive maw suddenly filled his vision, teeth drenched in gore and vitriol, consuming the hallway as he attempted to flee. But suddenly, a small hand pierced the veil of this nightmare, the horrific imagery shimmering away like a wisp of smoke in the wind. The hand was gray in color, accompanied by a small, grinning pair of humanoid teeth floating in the air above this outstretched hand. An ethereal voice echoed towards him through the inky blackness as the mouth moved. "Want to make a wager, stranger?" Looking down at the hand, then back up at the still grinning teeth, it continued before Rubin could reply. "I bet the souls of all the innocent folk in the land that you've got all the guts you need to make a difference when the time comes." Once more, without waiting for a reply, the hand reached out, grasped Rubin's, shaking vigorously. "Deal! And don't worry, I make a habit of keeping all my debts in order." Prove me right, friend. Rubin awoke in a cold sweat once more, the claws of the darkness around him suddenly dissipating. As he panted heavily, reeling at the nightmarish vision and its impossible implications, a fire suddenly erupted in his shoulder, causing him to yell out in fright and pain. Looking down, he found a crossbow bolt embedded there in the flesh. Suddenly another joined it in his arm, fresh fire exploding from the wound. His limbs burned as they lost their mobility. The sound of shuffling feet suddenly drew his attention to the darkness behind him. Hooded figures in black and silver garb melted from the darkness, hissing and whispering to each other in an unknown tongue. As Rubin's vision began to fade, the faces of the two figures came into view, their lips turned up into cruel, malicious smiles. Drow. Rubin's world spun as his body went limp and his hearing swam. Hauling him to his unresponsive feet, they began dragging him into the darkness as it engulfed his vision and mind. The next of our band of adventurers is the rough and excitable Druid-Boxey Ciarra, played by Buxbi. Easily distracted by things of a shiny and valuable nature, she was raised by her adoptive mother. She had been saved from a life of slavery by this mysterious but loving woman, as her birth parents were being sold into slavery when she was but a few years old. Her birth mother had begged the woman to take her cub, to purchase her, to protect the young one from the horrid life that presented itself before them. Though she had been happy being raised by her surrogate mother, a piece of her heart always dreamed of finding her birth parents and saving them. For years she had been living on her own. It hadn't been the easiest or the most glamorous, but she had come to enjoy the freedom and independence. It had helped that she had discovered a kinship with both the animals and the forests around her hometown at an early age. And the older she grew, the more she preferred the companionship of the forest and its denizens more than the dusty, noisy, distrusting city, until she eventually struck out on her own. It wasn't much different. Foraging and scrounging for food, sleeping under the stars, waking up with the warmth of the sun. But it was, oh, so much more peaceful and enjoyable. And it was as she traveled further and further from the cities of men, the whisper of the world itself came to her. It was a soothing, happy, joyful whisper that filled her soul as she spent her days in the wilderness, connecting to the druidic magic and lifestyle she had found herself in. But as the days went on, eventually those whispers turned hateful, fearful, mad, and distrustful. Rough nights started. The poisoned voice made its way through her soul, skin and fur, tossing and turning most nights, until finally, as she took shelter from heavy rains near a river under an outcropping of rocks, it culminated into one horrific, pivotal, screaming nightmare. In a vast, endless sea of darkness, an enormous skull floated before Xeara. Covered in fungus and mold, its sightless eyes peered towards her, and as if the jawless thing was smiling broadly, a wave of comfort washed over her, like an old friend that seemed to welcome her presence. Then came the groan and the scream. Twisting painfully, the skull turned from her, a horrid, acrid, putrid presence showing itself on the skull's back. A black, rotting wave cascading from a spike of foreign fungus, covering the pleasant yellows and browns of the skull's mold into a vile purple and black putrid mess. A cackling filled Xeara's soul and the air around her as the skull was encased fully, a groan of pain and death rocking her soul. With a scream, she started awake. Drenched in sweat, her breathing labored, Xeara clutched her chest tightly. The voice of the world was silent. Gone. An emptiness ate its way into her heart, and she couldn't help but cry in fear and sadness at that, paired with the horrid nightmare. Was it a vision? Or something worse? Suddenly her ears snapped backwards in alert fright, a mere instant before a fire erupted from her shoulder. Xeara screamed in rage as she tried to turn and face the attacker, only to hear another thwip, followed by a second fire erupting in her arm. Looking down as a numbness flowed from the painful fire, 2 crossbow bolts protruded from her arm. Growling in primal rage, Xeara tried to leap to her feet, only to fall forward, her legs unresponsive as the rest of her limbs became heavy, her eyelids quickly following suit. Footsteps and chuckling emerged from the night, and as her hearing swam, she could hear them speaking in a tongue she could not understand, but their dialect and accent were easily recognizable. Drow. The rest of their words turned into slurred mumbles as a darkness forcibly overtook Xeara's senses once more. No amount of willpower could halt the coming sleep, and she fell unconscious with rage in her heart. The third of our unlikely little group is the taciturn sorceress, Sahvra Miala, played by Suzi. Orphaned before she could even remember, she was raised in servitude to a noble family. There she stayed until later in life when she met her future wife, the mysterious Druid-Boxey woman, Quiet Song. She was saved from a deadly fate at the hands of the shadowy organization that Song worked for when the noble family she was serving under was deemed a threat and was completely eradicated, save for Sahvra, against the orders that Song had received from her organization. They lived together for years in their own apartment, before one day Song never returned from one of her missions. It was then this same shadowy organization showed itself to Sahvra. They conscripted her into servitude with the vague, always distant promise of one day, perhaps, seeing Song again. So she worked for this organization, the Zentarim. The odd mission here and there, quickly proving herself as one of their best and most trusted information and intelligence gatherers. But, as always with the Zentarim, the deeper workings of the organization and the higher echelons were always above her head, save for her direct supervisor, as well as those of the same rank. The name Davra Jasur was not unknown to Sahvra when she opened the missive. Ostensibly in charge of finding new and promising recruits, Davra was the head of internal affairs, or perhaps at least one of many. She had known that Davra valued order and discipline, as well as a drive and ambition, embodying these traits herself. The office that Sahvra eventually found herself in was simple: a desk, 2 chairs, a few small bookcases, but nothing that couldn't be packed and gone within moments. This fact was not lost to Sahvra. Sahvra, I'll not waste either of our time. I have a special task for you. Davra circled to the other side of the desk and handed Sahvra a small leaflet. A noble family is looking for someone. They don't know his name, nor his exact whereabouts, but we know the region he was last sighted. You are to find this man, and either kill him and bring proof of the deed, or bring him in alive for questioning. What was his crime? Sahvra's curiosity almost loosened the professionalism in her voice as she glanced over the leaflet. Murder and malpractice. Posed as a learned doctor and killed a young girl in cold blood. Or so the report says. Davra's tone caused Sahvra to glance up at her quizzically. You do not trust the information? The regent this comes from is a known malcontent. Always fishing for scraps he is undeserving of, with cries of wolves that turn out to be but pups. So I am skeptical of the things he says. But that is unimportant. He promises a large amount of support from his estate and his wealth. So we have decided to aid. Sahvra's eyes glanced back down at the leaflet. The name Ontari Lafal, as well as a location in the countryside, were all that was written. For the Black Network. Sahvra stood and prepared to bow and leave, but Davra held up her hand. Spying and information gathering is no longer the sole task being asked of you. You have been held from combat due to the short-sightedness of certain individuals in the organization. From this mission on, assassinations in combat will become more commonplace. Your loyalties have already been assured, and have been for years. But know this. Davra leaned in close and placed her fingertips against the paper. It ignited harmlessly in Sahvra's grasp, burning to ash in mere seconds. There are no secrets in the Zentarim. I have been given a very specific reward to bestow upon you, should this task be completed to satisfaction. A strange shiver travels down Sahvra's spine as she looked into Davra's steeled gaze and nodded. Song. Sahvra's blood froze in an instant, her heart stopping. She could feel the world around her spinning and swirling, but through sheer force of will she kept her balance. One of her hands snaked its way up her chest, grasping the small ring hanging on its chain there with a ferocious intensity as her gaze hardened, her back straightening fully and shoulders squaring. Good. Now go. For the Black Network! Weeks later, Sahvra was easily able to find the trail of the man she was looking for. The fire that burned in her veins surged through her body as she tracked him from village to village, town to town. Every place she visited, she was another day closer. Even the torrential downpour of the last few days, ceaseless in its intensity and wrathful in its ferocity, could slow Sahvra's pursuit. A cave. A campfire, long burned to ash, but not that long. Blood on the stone, a mere day or two old. Her prey was within sight. She stood there, looking out into the forest, her hand grasping the ring hanging from her neck tightly once more, her hand shaking from its hardening grip. Sahvra sighed deeply, closing her eyes, unable to stop the flood of emotions as they came once more, standing there in silence. Suddenly, Sahvra's world exploded into pain as she reeled, fire exploding from her shoulder, followed almost instantly by another in her arm. Panic coursed through her body as she spun in place, one of her hands already pulling her magical focus from her robes, only for her to weakly fall to her knees. The fire in her shoulder and arms coursed through her body, her limbs numbing quickly. Attempting to raise her focus once more, her arms shook weakly before she fell forward. A sinister chuckling floated to her swimming ears as two drow emerged from the shadows in the cave that had been behind her. Sahvra's rage and fury were useless as she slipped further into unconsciousness, and as her eyes finally closed, all she could feel was sorrow. Failure. And the fourth of this strange party was the gentle barbarian Amazonian Marx. A runt for an Amazonian, and male at that, made him a strange companion to his larger and almost all-female peoples. Living a difficult but cared-for and decent life, Marx enjoyed his time with his sisters. At a young age, he proved himself to his tribe as well as his future love, Vol, and cemented himself in their hearts and minds, as well as hers. His coming-of-age trial was a 3-year test to bring back the proof of a mighty battle that he had triumphed over a powerful foe. But due to his selfless and caring nature, he never went out of his way in search for a fight. He protected people and provided help and succor to those in need. But this purity was shown in his trophies of teeth and bones upon his return to his village, and was welcomed with open arms and loving hearts. But his love, Vol, had been given an honored title and a mission, and had left mere weeks earlier. So, he waited. 2 years passed, and it was discovered that Vol and her group had been murdered by an evil Amazonian by the name of Sergius, a man who had sought to forcefully take control of all Amazons for power, who had been banished centuries before. Relinquishing his standing and title in the village, Marx set out after Sergius. Not for revenge for his murdered love, but because Marx knew in his heart and soul that if Sergius was left unchallenged, great evils would befall his beloved people and the surrounding land. And so, he began tracking his quarry. Though Marx had been tracking him for months, he felt as if he hadn't made any real headway. All signs and tracks felt the same age, no matter how much ground he covered. But as he continued, over the course of the next few days, a few things quickly became apparent. Sergius had been traveling to various disparate tribes of simpler creatures, orcs, goblins, Goliath, the like. Their respective camps had been left barren and abandoned, save for a single, rotting corpse at each site, every single one of them missing its head. Marx's travels continued, and the signs were finally increasingly easy to track, finally becoming fresher. But the size of this retinue was growing by the day, and despite the last few days of torrential rainfall, Marx had finally caught up with his foe in the night. The rain was intense, drowning out all but the loudest of noises. The rocky outcropping Marx crawled up was rough, scratching his skin as he carefully poked his head over the edge. There, in a massive camp in a small valley, there were easily a few hundred creatures, dancing around fires that were underneath tents and beast hides. And in the center of the congregation, screaming out at the gathering, was Serges. Multiple skulls adorned his figure, a necklace of them draped over his massive frame, one on each of his shoulders and knees, as well as the absolutely massive skull of an ogre atop his own head. The man was holding aloft an equally massive axe, similarly adorned with skulls and bones, as he chanted and screamed, receiving resounding responses from the throng each time. There was a mad look in his eyes as he scanned the crowd, the language he was speaking completely foreign to Marx. Suddenly, Serges's eyes scanned towards Marx, and despite the distance, rain, and dark, their eyes locked. Serges's words stopped. An unnatural cold gripped Marx's soul, sending ice through his veins. Serges's appearance seemed to shift and grow, his presence becoming monstrous, an absolute fear coursing through Marx's body as a sinister grin on Serges's face. Shouting loudly, the man pointed towards Marx with his axe, and every head in the camp turned to follow. Abject terror gripped Marx's heart and mind as all those evil glares fell upon him. An evil, baleful light seemed to glint from Serges's eyes suddenly, and something snapped in the back of Marx's mind. He fell. His feet were already in motion by the time they met the ground. The fear was coursing through him powerfully, almost physical in its absolute intensity. Nothing in his life had ever caused this kind of visceral reaction, not even staring into the open maw of a foul creature 10 times his size. Abject terror bled from his mouth as he whimpered, tripping and reeling every so often as he fled. Through the rain, Marx could hear the thunderous cacophony of hundreds of feet in the mud, the sound of the cheering, jeering, screaming creatures chasing him as they grew in intensity, all while the rush of the river ahead of him slowly grew louder. As Marx leapt onto the giant fallen tree he had used as a bridge earlier, his foot twisted painfully on the slick wood, his body following his foot's descent. A fresh wave of fear overtook him as the icy waters consumed his world. Swirling, spinning, and tumbling, working for air to stay afloat, his arms burned. A small blessing to his god Harmonia escaped his mind as his hand finally found purchase on a rough boulder. Wrenching himself from the water, Marx hacked and coughed, falling forward onto the rock, panting and wheezing, the water of the swollen river still tugging at his legs. As he slowly climbed to his knees, a sound nearby suddenly caught his attention. Looking up, he froze. There, sitting around a warm-looking campfire, were 4 drow. They were all staring at Marx, surprise and confusion evident on their faces. For a few tense moments, there was no motion from any of them. Suddenly, chaos ensued. All 4 drow drew small crossbows, each one firing a bolt, their faces turning to scowls and grins. Marx twisted through the air, leaping towards them, avoiding 2 of the bolts, but 2 struck true, one in his chest and the other in an arm. They burned with an unnatural fire, the burning sensation surging from where they were embedded in his skin. But Marx's rage pushed him on, his fury allowing him to easily toss one of the attackers into the river with a confident shout. Another attacker was slammed into the ground, his face burying itself in the campfire, but the other 2 drow reacted faster than their compatriots, each one loading and firing another bolt into Marx's large frame. The combined fire coursing into his body from all 4 of these bolts overwhelmed Marx's senses in a flood of lethargy. The screams of the burned drow swam in his ears as Marx fell to his knees, his arms going limp even as he screamed in defiant rage. The other 2 drow walked towards him, and as his visage swam, Marx lashed out when they were within reach. His hand encased one of their throats, and as the drow gurgled and clawed at Marx's arm as his grip slowly crushed tighter, a fresh flare of fire burst forth from Marx's chest, as yet another bolt found itself in his body. The last of his energy finally spilling from him, he fell backwards, his world turning black before he could even feel the embrace of the dirt. And the 5th and final member of this group of unlikely compatriots is the clever rogue of a mousefolk, Meeps Cloverear. Hailing from a distant continent across the sea that near no one had ever heard of, she had left a world of arranged marriages and noble families behind, in trade for a life on the open road of adventure. New experiences every day was her bread and butter, and the dust of travel her constant companion. The long, dusty road from home had definitely been a difficult one, though. Hardships, prejudices, potential predators, and myriad other difficulties had hounded her ever since she had left home. But she wouldn't have had it any other way. The sights, the sounds, the smells, the drinks, and most importantly, the food. All so worth it. Never in her wildest dreams could she have imagined such fun was to be had on the open road so far from home. The occasional fancy trinket or bright coin would find its way into a missive bound for home, along with a thoughtful letter. Sure, her family probably didn't appreciate it much, and they probably thought she had abandoned her duty, but that was just not the life she wanted to live. Boundless and free, adventuring the land and seeing the sights, that is truly the life she craved. Though she could definitely do without the constant stares and whispers. So she was a giant mouse to these people, so what? People reacted as if she were some common were-rat, the nerve. But, as she panted heavily in the dense foliage, holding her family's crest tightly in one hand, a crossbow bolt lodged in her other now limp arm, Meeps couldn't help but wish for better circumstances. The enemy had descended upon her suddenly in the dead of night. Only the whispers of the animals nearby saved her from her pursuer's wrath. Her legs were starting to feel slightly sluggish as that unnatural fire emanated from the bolt in her arm. The torrential storm above helped drown out her panting, but it was also hindering her ability to hear her attackers. There had been two of them, tall, thin, clad in black and silver clothing, and using hand crossbows with bolts laced with some sort of toxin or poison. What did they want? Why were they so fixated on her capture? She had done her best to not incur anyone's anger or wrath in her days on the road, so their pursuit was frightening. Her heart skipped a beat in the dim light as she noticed that one of her attackers was pointing towards her hiding place. The other one wasn't visible, but as she looked around carefully, she noticed the crimson spattering of her own blood on the leaves nearby. Suddenly, another piercing shock of flame found itself in her back. Shrieking, she leapt from her hiding place, but the fire pulsing through her body hit her legs and they went weak. She lost her balance halfway through the leap, sliding on her belly and face in the mud. The two figures were upon her almost instantly. Their faces were grinning and full of malice as they watched her squirm. She cursed at them as loudly as she could muster in her native beast tongue, but her voice cracked as her lids grew heavy. Darkness covered her vision as consciousness finally faded from her, mud covering her body and hands roughly grabbing at her clothing. And with that, you have an introduction to each character as they were introduced to the game before the first session. A brief explanation of their backstory, as well as their own personal little introduction that I had written for them to the adventure. From there, the characters and players were introduced to the campaign setting of Out of the Abyss. The characters awoke from their poison-induced slumber in a world of complete darkness, each one locked in their own cage, bound by shackles and manacles. The occasional voice or sound, and sometimes the luminescent fungus, broke up the many hours of bumpy travel through the dark tunnels. Eventually, they found themselves in an underground outpost of the Drow, Velkenvelv, which was run and controlled by a Drow priestess woman by the name of Ilvara Mizrim. Notified that they would eventually be made into slaves of the main city of Menzoberranzan, they were told to conform to their new master's will, accept their fate, and learn to obey if they wished to survive. They were then locked in a cell, bereft of all their possessions, their hands chained to metal collars. But there they also found other prisoners. The twin deep gnomes Topsy and Turvy, another deep gnome named Jimjar, the strange and quiet Dero Boopido, a quaggoth by the name of Darendil, a dwarf named Eldeth, the fishman Kuotoa Shushar, a drow named Sereth, an orc named Ront, and a myconid sprout named Stool. A brief round of introductions ensued, followed by Marx immediately breaking his bonds with a powerful feat of strength. An escape plan was quickly hatched when one of the higher-ranking guards offered to leave their cell unlocked, wishing to bring shame upon the mistress and her current right-hand man. The entire prison cell quickly lined up to have Marx continue showing off his physical prowess, breaking each of them from their bonds as they discussed plans of escape. Upon leaving their dimly lit cell, they quickly discovered how detrimental pure darkness was for most of the group, being unable to see in the dark. But with resourcefulness, they quickly found their way to the next room where they were told their belongings were being kept. Which is where they were told their belongings were being kept. The party ambushed a few guards who were off duty, Marx using his broken manacle collar as a makeshift weapon. There were a few close calls with a superior armed force, but they eventually dispatched the 3 guards and quickly found their belongings in a chest in a room above. Re-geared and re-outfitted, they discussed the next plan of action, and decided to dive into the lake below the suspended outpost, hoping the sound of the waterfall covered their escape. A force of giant spiders loyal to the drow attempted to stop their attempts to jump from the webbing and into the water below, but were dispatched quickly. Finally leaping into the water, their escape seemed all but assured, but as they pulled themselves from the water, they discovered that someone, or perhaps something, was attempting to drag the orc Ront further into the water. They attempted to help, but unfortunately it proved too late, as the orc was already being digested by a grey ooze that had made itself at home in the lake. Though, due to his bullying attitude and demeanor, no one was too distraught over his loss. To add to their troubles, it was then that demons and other vile creatures suddenly descended upon the cavern, the outpost of Velkenvelv rallying to fight off these sudden intruders. As they started running, they noticed there seemed to be demons fighting other demons, with the outpost seemingly caught in the middle. Not wishing to get caught up in affairs not their own, the large, motley assortment of individuals made their way deep into the caverns of the Underdark. The Kuotoa fishman, Shushar, had posed a decent enough plan to the party during their discussions of escape. They would travel in the direction of his home, which was on the shores of Dark Lake, a massive underground lake that was big enough to be considered an entire sea, where the adventurers could secure passage to elsewhere near Dark Lake, and perhaps even resupply if needed. Emboldened by the idea of a way home, the group set forth into the darkness. Their supplies meager, with many mouths to feed, a necessity for foraging made itself apparent, on top of them needing to keep their tracks covered, a fear of being pursued weighing heavily on their minds. The going was fast at the start, with little rest and little food, as they put as much distance between them and their captors as possible. But after a few days, the need for food and covering their tracks caused their movements to slow. Harrowing battles and close encounters with creatures that wished for their destruction or a next meal were commonplace. One fateful encounter with beasts known as Umberhulks, they found themselves in the midst of a cave-in. Luckily, they were not separated, but they discovered the way behind them was blocked off, and a sigh of relief washed through the whole party. Their rest was cut short, however, as it was discovered the twins, Topsy and Turvy, were in fact lycanthropes. Were-rats, specifically. They suddenly started turning and changing, a full moon evident on the surface, world far above. Scared their companions would shun or hurt them, the twins did their best to push the rest of the group away, but kind words and acceptance is what they experienced from the party. Growing closer to their allies, the twins decided to stay, and so they all traveled on, and eventually came upon a great and expansive fissure in the rock and earth, with a forest of webbing in sizes ranging from a hair to an ancient tree trunk. There, they came upon 2 strange goblins that could, surprisingly, speak common. Yuck Yuck and Spiderbait were their names. Self-proclaimed web runners, they promised safe passage through the area known as the Silken Paths for a very meager fee. Taking the guides up on their offer and even offering extra compensation, the party continued on their path. When they were nearing the end of their route, they discovered a trapped gnome who was only just waking from the numbing venom of the giant spiders that made the area their home. An archaeologist and ruins delver, his adventuring party had been ambushed by mad gnolls. He had been the only survivor, but as he was hiding from the gnolls, he had been attacked and poisoned by the spiders, who made him ready for their next meal. In thanks for their timely arrival and help, Fargus Rumblefoot offered the group a chance at the treasures the ruins nearby surely held. Lost in the Underdark as well, Fargus would need to return to the ruins for any chance at guiding the group back to the surface, though his group's guide was dead, and the path was very unfamiliar to him. Interested in only the archaeological knowledge and treasures, any materialistic values they found, he would gladly give them, if they were to escort him there. While some in the party were reluctant at first, eventually they agreed to help Fargus, if only because it seemed the ruins were in the same direction they were already traveling. Upon arriving at the ruins, which was a pyramid-shaped mausoleum, unbelievably floating above a great, empty expanse, Meeps suddenly heard a voice, crying out in desperation, pleading for help, and for someone to free them from the darkness. Though none of the other party heard such words. With Fargus's help, the group entered the ruins. Murals and depictions of a peoples long since gone from the world greeted them. Once more, the pleas for help reached Meeps' ears, but none of the others. Exploring the ruins more, the group fell upon various rooms with tombs in them. But before anything could be done, Fargus himself cried out in fright and pain as a phantom drained his life force after he disturbed one of the tombs. A battle with the undead specters ensued, but was quickly over thanks to Xeara's and Sahvra's magical prowess. An overly curious Xeara then led the group to discover magical weapons and artifacts hidden in each of the 4 sarcophagi they had found. Sahvra obtained a powerful magician staff, and Xeara a sling that could shoot meteors. A very special rapier was Rubin's, and a powerful and honorable spear was there for Marx. A third time, the voice rang in Meeps' ear, leading her to find a secret passage hidden beneath one of the sarcophagi. Venturing further, they revealed the mistress of the long-dead warriors, Brisis of Caim. They had incurred her anger and wrath for disturbing her tomb, her words and actions tainted as if driven mad. During the fight that ensued, a voice pleaded for Meeps to open the sarcophagus there, promising for help. Forcing her way into the sarcophagus as her companions continued the fight, Meeps discovered a single golden sword hilt resting on a long mummified corpse. Picking it up, the voice rang in her ears once more, begging her to speak words of power. Light, come forth. With those words spoken, a beam of pure sunlight sprung from the hilt in Meeps' hands, forming into a blade of sunlight. Using this newfound weapon, Meeps quickly turned the tide against the sinister wraith that still harried her and her friends. The danger now dealt with, the party took time to search once more, finding an invisible stone chest nearby, holding much wealth and treasures. They left the tomb and met back up with the rest of the group waiting for them outside, and they continued on their journey, powerful weapons and artifacts greatly aiding them. But when they rested for the night, they each took time to attune themselves to their new artifacts. Meeps discovered her newfound sword was known as Dawnbringer, a sentient, ancient weapon forged specially to fight demons, undead, and other evil creatures of the darkness. On top of this, Meeps had discovered a book in her belongings that she hadn't known of before. Using the magical knowledge written on the pages inside, she called into the Fey world for a companion, and received one. Fluke. Her own companion and familiar, he was a simple creature, but loving and ready to help. It wasn't many more days of traveling before they finally came upon the shores of Darklake. But before that, they attempted to free their companion, Darendil, of the curse of polymorph he said was upon him. Attempting to purge this curse, it was discovered he was a driven mad Quaggoth, who then went into a rage. They had to kill him to progress. True to his word, though, Xushar recognized their location when they finally came upon Darklake, and happily led the way towards his village. But as they neared, they were set upon by a crazed group of Kuo-toa. Shushar's pleas for a peaceful resolution seemed to fall on deaf ears, and the party had to defend themselves. Shortly after, another party of Kuo-toa appeared before them, though this one was much more amicable. Led by a close friend of Xushar, Archpriest Pluploplin, they explained that a strange cult had recently begun rising in town. This cult revered a destructive, bloodthirsty Gaul they called Limogugon, and were causing rifts in the townsfolk, and unfortunately were a cause for great concern. The town of Slubludop was unable to assist the travelers in their course unless this cult was dealt with. The Archpriest suggested a plan to use the adventurers as bait, offering them to the leader of the cult as a gift of parley. When the time came to hand the adventurers over, the Archpriest's own people would ambush the unaware cultists, allowing the adventurers to avoid any fighting, and they would receive a boat to the Duergar city of Gracklestug with a guide for their troubles. Reluctantly, the party agreed. The villagers bound the party's wrists in rope in a way that made it appear the bindings were fast, but were simple loops that could easily and quickly be removed by the person bound. Upon arriving at the ramshackle and derelict village, the plan seemed to be going well. The cultists were gathered together to receive the gift of supplication from the Archpriest. At the most opportune moment, the Archpriest's followers attacked, but things did not go as planned. The water of Darklake bubbled and frothed as blood spilled into its depths, and cries to Limogugon rose up louder. During the fighting, as the party was gathering themselves at the docks, terror struck. Bursting forth from the water, two oily, black tentacles writhed into the air. Rising from the depths, two monstrous heads came forth, resembling hideous, angry baboons with wickedly curved tusks. Both heads were attached to a single torso, the monster's red eyes burning with bloodlust and madness. The creature was easily 30 feet or more, water cascading down its back and shoulders. Reaching its full height, the great demon threw back both its heads and roared mightily, shaking the souls of those who witnessed it. The demon lord, Demogorgon himself, had risen from the depths of Darklake. As each of the party was driven temporarily insane or mad in their own way, their mortal minds barely holding together at the mere sight of a lord of demons, they all gathered onto two boats, accompanied by a Duergar that had been captured by the cultists who had now been freed, and fled onto the lake, even as Demogorgon continued his destruction of Slubludop. When they had finally recovered from their madness and gotten their bearings, they discovered their new traveling companion was brothers with a weapons manufacturer in Gracklestug. The Duergar city was their next best bet on finding a caravan or guide to the surface. Situated on the coast of Dark Lake as well, it would be nearly 20 days of rowing and maneuvering the lake to get there. Their new companion was confident he could get them there, though. Using her shape-shifting abilities, Xeara greatly sped up their progress, using the form of a giant octopus at regular intervals to pull both boats at a higher speed. All in all, the trials and tribulations and difficulties of Darklake were a welcome distraction from the horror they had witnessed in Slubludop, and from the much more difficult path they had to the Kuo-toa village. Upon arriving at the docks to Gracklestug, they witnessed a Duergar being attacked, only to learn it was the brother of their new companion. Rushing to help, they dispatched the attackers, and were given a promise from the brothers for powerful weapons as thanks. But the group had not gone unnoticed by the townsguard. Quickly surrounded, outnumbered, and heavily outarmed, They had no choice but to comply with the captain of the guard's demands to be investigated properly for their attempt at entering the city unnoticed. But strangely, Boopido was nowhere to be seen. On their way to the guard's headquarters, the large group of adventurers, prisoners, and guards were assaulted by a rampaging stone giant, a twisted second head sprouting from its shoulder. Lending their aid, the party helped the town's guard dispatch the threat, subduing the creature. Soon after, another stone giant appeared, worried for his friend that had suddenly gone on a rampage. Their help and willingness to stay despite not being guarded painted the group in a different light to the captain. But protocol was protocol, and they were brought before General of the Guard. But not before the stone giant asked them to come visit the home of the stone giants here in the city, as their elder would wish to thank them for their saving of their brother. In exchange for their freedom to be in the city proper, despite trying to smuggle themselves in unnoticed, the General of the Guard, Erday Blackskull, wished to enlist the outsiders' help, as they were a third party. Politics and bureaucracy tied her hands as well as those of her companions and her subordinates, and she could not investigate these issues herself. There were whispers of corruption in her ranks as well as the ranks of the Duro leaders, and any information they came across regarding those would be of great service. But the main task she set forth for them was the finding and capturing of a wily Duro by the name of Jiroki. A smuggler for various parties, he was also under suspicion of the same conspiracy with Duro's Council of Savants in Gracklestug. Agreeing to help if it meant being able to travel freely through the town and find a guide to the surface, the party was given lodging at the inn designated for outsiders. For the first night in over a month, they had hot baths, hot meals, and warm, soft beds available to them. In terms of surface world standards, these accoutrements were most definitely bottom rung, the bare minimum to be serviceable. But due to their long and difficult journey up to this point, it may as well have been a king's quarters, a much-deserved rest. It didn't last nearly long enough. Upon waking, a representative of a group by the name of the Keepers of the Flame had come to bring the party before their leader, Gartakar Zundorn, in the Durgar-only section of the city. Once the group was rounded up, they headed that way with their escort. The guards let them pass into the forbidden sections of the city only because of their entourage. Upon arriving at the headquarters to the Keepers of the Flame, Gartakar greeted them. He then informed them that it was not actually him that had demanded an audience, but instead, it was the adult red dragon in their employ, the dragon known as Themberchild, the same dragon that powered the city's forges with his flames. The audience chamber opened, and the party was brought before the red dragon, Themberchild the Ever-Burning, the father of the flame. The foundry's heart was a large, obviously overfed and pampered, adult red dragon, lay at the other end of the room, leisurely resting on a mountain of gold, jewels, and other valuables. Once the party was brought before him, Themberchild demanded all other peoples leave the room. When they were finally alone, the doors closed, and the conversation that followed was tense and carefully worded. Themberchild had a request for the group, but coming from a dragon, requests were not always requests. There were many eyes and ears in the city, belonging to those of power. The adventurer's arrival had brought an opportunity, and Themberchild was going to capitalize on it. He told the party that Gartakar was up to something, but he wanted to know what it was. He also knew that Gartakar was going to ask the party a favor. He didn't care what the favor ended up being, but demanded that any and all findings that they would have given to Gartakar, they were instead to bring to him first. In exchange, the party would receive a portion of Themberchild's hoard. That, and he wouldn't eat them. Given no real choice in the matter, the party accepted, and they were shortly released from the audience chamber. Once the doors closed behind them, Gartakar made his move as well. He asked that the adventurers investigate a group by the name of the Grey Ghosts. The group had stolen a red dragon egg that the Keepers of the Flame had been safeguarding. The dragon in the egg was going to eventually replace Themberchild, the restless dragon quickly becoming more than the Keepers could handle. Leaving the Keepers behind, the group decided to stop by the Stone Giants and met with the Elder there, Stone Speaker Hagram. Hagram gave them personal thanks for not killing their brother earlier, but delivered an ominous and frightening omen and prophecy. That Stone itself had been whispering to him to deliver this message. Before departing, he gave them a large crystal, telling them that there would eventually come a time when they would need it. Finally finished in the closed-off sections of the city, they were escorted back into the common grounds. Finally given free reins of this side of the city, they quickly set out for the markets to resupply, look for hints for any of their objectives, and secure passage to the surface as quickly as possible. Eventually, after witnessing various signs of strange behavior and circumstances throughout the city, they happened upon the only merchant that seemed to have surface goods. It was owned and operated by a Duergar woman by the name of Ilsa Henstack. Questions and inquiries followed, which eventually led to the woman bringing them deep into her stall, past an invisible door and into a hidden warehouse. Once in her private chambers, Ilsa explained that she was finding more and more surface items in the hands of the Duro, who had been using the items for barter and trade more and more frequently. A strange and curious thing, as she was the forefront of surface items in the Darklake district of Gracklestug, and the Duro were not allowed to go to the surface. Being surfacers, Ilsa had hoped the party would be able to find out what the Duro's channel of merchandise was coming from. In exchange for their information and time, Ilsa would help them reach the surface. Unfortunately, the next caravan planned to the surface out of Gracklestug was 3 months away, having just missed the most recent one a few weeks ago. The deal was that Ilsa would secure safe passage with one of her contacts in the deep gnome city of Blingdenstone. There, the merchants and travelers made frequent trips to the surface, at the minimum of once a month. Using her influence and contacts, she could guarantee the party a trip to the surface the moment they needed it out of Blingdenstone. Not wishing to stay underground without the sight of the sun and trees for 3 more months, the party begrudgingly accepted yet another task. And so, after securing the promise of this, as well as much better prices at the shop from Ilsa, the party resupplied and delved into the deeper and seedier parts of the Dark Lake district, the hunt for any clues towards their objectives being the forefront in their mind and attention. After hours of investigation and observation, the party caught sight of one of their objectives, the wily Duro Droki, whom Erde wanted for questioning. Quickly giving chase, the party unfortunately lost the fast and streetwise Duro as he entered the derelict and filthy West Cleft district, one of the homes of the Duro. Using stealth and disguise, the party worked their way through the district. Fights and disagreements were rampant in the squalid district, filth and trash littering the streets and alleys. But eventually, the keen eye of Meeps discovered a well-hidden passageway, hidden in an alley behind a wall of debris and detritus. Venturing in, the group found a vast network of tunnels and passageways that sprawled out beneath the entire city of Gracklestug. Near the entrance, they found a small section of the cave that seemed to have been turned into a personal sleeping area, with moldy bread rolls, trash, and trinkets. Deciding to lay in wait, the party hid themselves. It didn't take long for them to discover Droki arriving in his makeshift home. Springing their ambush, they quickly and easily overpowered the Duro, capturing and binding the small man. Rifling through his belongings, they found incriminating evidence and a few valuables. Happily, they returned to the city above, handing over Droki to Erde, earning her respect, as well as a sigil of the townsguard that labeled them a friend, ensuring that no third party would attempt to capture them and turn them into slaves, as was a common practice here in Gracklestug to outsiders. Obfuscating the existence of the tunnels to Erde, wishing to keep it a secret until their investigations were complete, they decided to retire after their long day. Waking once more, rested and happy with their current living quarters, they paid a visit to the brothers they had helped on the docks. For a discounted price, they received powerful new weapons, crafted by the brothers themselves, custom designed specifically for each member of the group, as thanks for assuring the safety of both brothers. Meeps received magical dual-hand crossbows that could reload hands-free. Marx received a magically returning axe head designed for throwing of great distances. There was a powerful druidic spear for Xeara, and Sahvra received mage's bracelets, making her cantrips stronger. For Rubin, the brothers magically forged together the artifact he found in the tomb, as well as another weapon he had found on the travels to this point. Finished with their dealings with the brothers, the party quickly made their way back to the tunnels under Gracklestug. Once there, they very quickly ran into a familiar fellow. Boopido was discovered to be a deranged and insane man, screaming about rituals and being a powerful being. The fight against him and the undead that rose at his command did not last long, and was over very easily. When the dust settled, the ghost of a deep gnome asked them to lay his remains to rest at his home of Blingdenstone. What was left of his body was an animated hand with a special ring, somewhere in this cave system. The party agreed, but as they went about examining the room, a strange pulse of magic erupted around them, their world swirling and cascading through color and blackness. Each party member then found themselves alone, sitting at a table, a grinning, cloaked figure sitting before them. His face was obscured, only his smiling mouth was visible. A deck of cards was sitting in the palm of his upturned hand, shuffling itself lazily in the air before coming back to rest, only to repeat the process. The entity called himself the Dealer, and was a strange esoteric person. He spoke of evils and futures that could be averted, and of other strange portents. But more importantly, he offered each one of them a chance to draw a very special card from his deck. Some cards were innocuous, but there were some that held much more power. Xeara pulled a card that gave her nightmares and restless nights, plagued by the vision of one of her companions, Marx, meeting an end at the hand of a superior force before his time, murdered in cold blood. Her and her companions could do nothing to change this, and the nightmares continued. Marx drew multiple cards. The first was a card that had him flip coins, drawing for each heads until he flipped 3 tails. Because of this, he ended up drawing 4 more, the first of which forced him to speak in rhyme for the rest of the session, and the second card gave him a personality trait. His third card allowed him to know the true answer to any question. But his fourth card was a card that granted him the power of wishes, 2 to be precise. A powerful boon with the potential for horrible repercussions. Cautiously, Rubin only drew 1 card from the deck, a card that let him avoid any situation. Once. Meeps, on the other hand, drew 3. The first increased her intelligence score, while the second could be invoked to create a great feast. The third was a portent of something much greater and more chaotic. The seasons on the surface had suddenly switched. Summer became winter, spring to fall. Chaos would ensue. And finally Sahvra. She also only drew 1. The power in the card allowed her to know the answer to her next dilemma. Their time with the dealer over, they were thrust back into their own world, each of them yet ignorant to the dealings they just encountered in a different time and different space, until they realized the power they had. Continuing on their journey into the tunnels, they encountered a pack of myconids, adult fungus folk. Their companions, who had wished to come along this time, Sereth and Stool, reacted strangely to this group of myconids. Stool was mistrusting, whereas Sereth seemed willing to hear their strange words. The group of myconids spoke of a grand wedding and danced slowly and strangely, as if to an unheard tune. They offered the party the chance to attend the ceremonies, beckoning them to come along. Sereth attempted to convince the group to no avail, but Stool refused outright. Another juvenile myconid, Rumpadump, left this group of myconids and joined Stool and the rest of the party, fearing for this group of myconid's safety. Sereth, though, joined the myconids, his body seemingly at odds with itself. A look of terror and despair filled his face and eyes as he looked back at the group one last time. Suddenly, his face lost all expression, going blank, and he walked with the myconids into a grove of mushrooms and fungi. The group seemingly melted into the wall, disappearing without a trace. That horror now behind them, the group quickly escorted Rumpadump and Stool back to the inn with the rest of the NPCs. A brief explanation of Sereth's fate, and the party returned to the caves. There, they went about slowly mapping out the area, searching for clues and treasures. One room they ventured into held starving bears in ramshackle cages, with Duro and Duragar arguing nearby. Releasing the beasts, the bears made quick work of their would-be captors, devouring their first real meal in weeks. A short thanks was given to Meeps in the tongue of beasts, and the bears fled. In the next room, they found a large pit, absolutely filled with corpses, some of which had risen, shambling about on more corpses that lay still, with a single guard. Rubin dispatched this guard easily and quietly, while Xeara then took care of the undead with a blast from a beaded necklace she had been holding onto. They then found the animated hand they had been tasked to find among the corpses. Retrieving it for their later trip to Blingdenstone, they continued on through the cavern. And that, my friends, is where this adventure is thus far. Many jokes, close calls, and adventurous deeds have happened up until now, but it is merely the beginning. From here, you may watch or listen to the recordings to continue with the story in detail, or just skip to the seasonal summaries. A word of warning, though. I am an imperfect being, as is all of us. There are times when I forgot to hit the record button, and either remembered partway into the day's session, or forgot about it entirely. And for that, I do apologize. I do not have the time to go back and watch all the hours and hours of footage and find out where I have missed bits and pieces and fill in, as I am doing this in my spare time. But rest assured, the story as a whole is still there. A single session here or there, 15 minutes to an hour at the start of a session, it's really not much in the grand scheme of things. If you wish to follow along in real time, we will most likely be streaming our SaturD&D games on Saturday mornings, sometime around 9 or 8 PST. Follow my Twitch channel, The Beardman Mike, for notifications for when we go live. New sessions will hopefully start up again sometime near the spring of 2020, no later than the end of May. I hope you enjoy the story our group is building, and the adventures we experience while doing so, and I look forward to continuing to bring you such things. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.